Outside, 30 degrees below zero. Inside, a child sleeps without a blanket. There is no glass in the windows of this house. There is no chimney in the roof. There is no insulation in the walls. And there is not a single piece of modern technology anywhere inside it doing the work of keeping that child alive. And yet, in a valley in southern Iceland, in a house very much like this one, families were born in that room, grew old in that room, and buried their parents from that room, generation after generation, while the wind outside stripped the warmth out of anything foolish enough to move. So, how did they do it? The answer was not a bigger fire. In fact, a bigger fire would have killed them faster, and before this is over, you are going to understand exactly why. We remember the Vikings for the things that left, the long ships, the raids, the crossings of an ocean that swallowed better sailors than them. But their greatest invention never left the shore. It sat low in the grass, half buried, quietly breathing smoke, looking like almost nothing at all. So, before we step inside, hold on to three things. First, there is one thing they deliberately chose not to build, and you would swear that living without it up there was a death sentence. Second, the warmest thing in that house was never the fire. And third, on the night the snow finally buried the house completely, that was the moment the family inside was safest of all. Stay with me, and by the end, you will not look at your own home the same way again. To understand that house, you first have to understand what these people had already lost. When the Norse first sailed into Iceland, the island was not the bare rock most of us picture today. Roughly a quarter of it was covered in birch woodland, close enough to the shore that a man could walk out with an axe and come home with a winter's worth of fuel. Within a few generations, almost all of it was gone. Cut for houses, cut for boats, cut for fires, and grazed down to the roots by their own sheep so it could never grow back. So the winters they had to survive were not only the ones nature handed them, they were partly winters of their own making. And every family after that lived inside the consequences of a choice their grandfathers made. Farther west in Greenland, it got harder still. A single log washed up on the beach, carried thousands of miles by ocean currents from Siberia, was not driftwood. It was an event, something the whole farm came down to the water to look at. You cannot burn your way out of a world like that. And so, somewhere in those bitter, thinning years, they stopped asking how to make more heat, and started asking how to lose less. That one question changed everything, and it built the walls. They cut the ground itself, thick blocks of soil laced together by living grass roots, and stacked them until the walls stood over 6 feet thick. Dirt does not sound like an advanced material until you understand what it was doing. Every block held millions of tiny trapped air pockets, slowing heat the way modern insulation does, while the sheer mass of all that earth soaked up warmth through the day and gave it back through the night. And then the walls did something no modern wall does. They kept growing. Season after season, the roots pushed deeper, sealing their own cracks, binding themselves tighter, until the house was stronger at 50 years old than the day it was finished. A timber house begins dying the moment you finish it. This one healed. They did not build a house on the land. They taught the land to become a house, so the walls held the heat. But something inside had to make it. And here is where I have to give you back the second thing I asked you to remember, because the warmest thing in that house was never the fire, it was breathing. When the dark closed in and the first real storms came off the water, the Norse did something that sounds, to modern ears, almost unthinkable. They brought the animals inside. Cattle, sheep, goats, sometimes the horses, walked in under the same roof as the children and stayed there until spring. And this was not desperation, it was arithmetic. A single cow gives off several hundred watts of body heat, hour after hour, all night, all winter, and it never asks for a stick of firewood. A small herd under your roof is a furnace that runs for months on hay. But the real intelligence was not bringing them in, it was where they put them. The animals stood on the lower ground at one end, below the raised wooden platforms where the family slept, because warm air rises, and rising was exactly what they wanted it to do. Nobody in that house would have called that engineering. They just called it building a house. And the same thinking shaped every opening. Doorways were built low and narrow, so that everyone who entered had to bow their head. That was not ceremony. That was physics. Many farms added a short entry passage that worked exactly like a modern airlock, catching the cold before it ever reached the fire. Windows barely existed at all. They chose darkness over heat loss every single time. which meant that all winter long, everyone lived in one room. Grandparents, parents, children, servants, animals, all of it. One space, one fire, one smell, one sound. Privacy was a luxury the cold simply did not allow. But then, neither was loneliness. Every heartbeat under that roof was a small fire that never needed wood. At the center of all of it, running down the length of the house like a spine, was the fire. Not a fireplace tucked against a wall, but a long, open hearth, in some houses stretching more than 30 feet from end to end. It was the kitchen, the furnace, the workshop, and the only real light in the world for months at a time. And everything a family did, they did along that line of flame. Around it and beneath it they packed heavy stones, and those stones drank heat all day and gave it back all night. So the house never swung wildly between scorching and freezing. It simply held. What they burned depended entirely on where they stood. Hardwood in the forests of Norway, peat cut from the bogs in Iceland, driftwood that had crossed an ocean to reach them. And in the poorest settlements of all, dried dung, dried and stacked with the same care another family would give a woodpile. Nothing in that world was garbage. Everything was fuel waiting for its turn. Which brings me back to the first thing I asked you to hold on to. The one thing they deliberately chose not to build. It was the chimney. Think about what a chimney actually does. It is a hole in your roof with a very efficient job, and that job is to take the warmest air in your house and throw it into the sky. Up there, that was not ventilation. That was suicide by convenience. So they faced a choice we have never had to make. Cleaner air or a warmer night. And they chose warmth, knowing exactly what it would cost them. The smoke rose and gathered under the high roof in a thick layer, a second ceiling of warm air pressing down on the living space below, while the family moved and slept and ate in the clear air underneath it. Small adjustable vents near the ridge let it leak out slowly, wider when they cooked. Nearly shut in the worst of the cold, the house breathed. But it breathed slowly, and the soot that settled on every beam turned out to be doing quiet work of its own, coating the timber in a dry black skin that fought off insects, rot, and damp. Centuries before wood preservative existed, they were treating their own house every single day, simply by living in it. But make no mistake, they paid for it. They paid with their lungs and with their eyes, and archaeologists have found the evidence written into their bones. Survival up there was never free. It was only ever a debt, chosen wisely. They did not remove the smoke, they gave it a job, and above all of it sat the last piece of the system, the roof. It was built in layers, the way you would build armor. First, the heavy timber frame, strong enough to carry a weight most modern roofs would collapse under. Then sheets of birch bark, peeled and laid overlapping across the beams, oily and waterproof, keeping rain and meltwater off the wood beneath. And then the turf. Thick slabs of it, laid down again and again until the roof weighed several tons, and that enormous weight did something you would never expect. It pressed the whole building down into the earth and held it there, so the North Atlantic wind could scream across it all night and find nothing to lift. Season after season, the grass roots stitched those layers into one living skin. A modern roof starts failing the day it goes on. This one settled in and got stronger, and then came the third thing I asked you to remember. The night the snow buried the house completely was the night the family inside was safest of all. We clear snow off our homes. They let it come. Fresh snow is packed with trapped air, one of the finest insulators nature has ever made, and as the drifts climbed the walls and swallowed the roof, the house got warmer, not colder. The worse the storm, the better the house worked. From a distance, an entire Norse farm could disappear under a white field, and the only proof that anyone was alive down there was a dark doorway and a thin thread of smoke rising out of the ground. What looked like a burial was a blanket, and that is the whole secret, because there is no single secret. Not the walls, not the animals, not the fire, not the smoke, not the snow. The genius was the order of it. Heat was made, then stored, then shared, then guarded, and only then, very slowly, allowed to leave. Today we have names for all of it. Passive design, thermal mass, green roofs, earth sheltering, building envelopes. Our best architects are quietly rediscovering, with equations, what those families worked out with nothing but frozen ground and 40 generations of paying attention. There is a valley in southern Iceland called Þjórsárlóð, and in it stood a farm called Stung. In the year 1104, the volcano Hekla erupted and buried that valley in ash, and the people fled and never came back. But the house did not fall. It stood there in the dark under the ash, walls and hearth and floor intact, for more than 800 years, until archaeologists lifted the ash away and found the rooms still holding their shape. The house outlived every person who ever slept in it. It outlived their language, their gods, and their names. So think back to where we started. A child asleep without a blanket, 30 below outside the wall. Their greatest masterpiece was never the ship. It was the house that kept them alive long enough to build one. They did not defeat winter. They gave it a place at the fire. Now, be honest with yourself for a second. Your house, tonight, with the power out and the heat off, how many days does it give you? Tell me down in the comments, because I think most of us already know the answer, and it is not a comfortable one. Thank you for staying with us to the end. There are 1,000 more of these buried out there, whole systems of survival that were forgotten the moment we stopped needing them, and we are digging them up one at a time. Stay with us, and we will find the next one together.